The door slammed behind me, my son's face a blur in the rear view as he drove away, leaving me alone on the cold, empty street. Still, I stood there, the silence of his betrayal ringing in my ears, the grip of the crumpled bills in my hand tighter than ever. As I walked into the motel, the sting of his actions settled in, and I realized the man who had shown me kindness wasn't just a stranger. He owned my son's company. That's when I knew. I wasn't just his mother anymore. I was something else now. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Kyle's eyes never left the road. He hadn't said a word for the last 15 minutes. His knuckles gripping the wheel so tight his fingers looked like they might snap off. Doris stared out the passenger window, watching the bare, cold trees blur past in the early evening light. The snow was already turning to slush, and the headlights of the car cast long shadows across the wet asphalt. They had been driving for what felt like hours. Kyle had never looked over, never even seemed to consider the discomfort building between them. Doris's hands clenched the small bag at her side, the one she'd managed to grab before he'd unceremoniously shoved her out of the house, calling it a temporary solution. "Where are we going, Kyle?" she'd asked earlier, her voice steady but edged with confusion. His eyes had briefly flicked to hers, but then he'd just nodded toward the highway, a cold, dismissive gesture. "You'll be fine. Just for a bit. I'll call you when it's time to figure out the next step." The next step. She didn't know if that was a promise or a lie, but now, as the car slowed to a halt in front of a rundown building with a flickering neon sign that read Sunset Motel, it felt like something between an insult and a final goodbye. Doris opened the door before the car had even come to a full stop. She didn't wait for him to tell her to get out. She just did. The icy wind bit at her skin as soon as her feet hit the pavement, but the sting of it didn't come close to matching the ache inside her chest. She stood there for a moment, watching as Kyle's car made a swift U-turn, tires screeching as he drove away without even glancing back. Her hands shook, but she tucked them into the pockets of her coat, feeling the small, crumpled bills inside her wallet. $13, $13, and nothing else. No phone, no directions, nothing. The motel lobby was small, cramped, and smelled like stale coffee. A man behind the desk looked her over with a quick, dismissive glance. Doris cleared her throat, hoping for something, some recognition, some tiny flicker of sympathy. But the desk clerk's face remained flat, devoid of interest. "No ID," he muttered, barely glancing at her. "No key." Doris felt the weight of his words settle in her chest like a stone. No key. She had nowhere to go. No place to rest her head. Not that she could go anywhere anyway. Her only option now was to sit, wait, and try to figure out what the hell had just happened. How had it come to this? She didn't argue. There was no point. She left the desk, walked slowly toward the sidewalk, and found a spot on the curb. She could feel the dampness of the concrete soaking through her shoes. But it was as if her body had gone numb to everything except the dull ache in her ribs. Cold, alone, incomplete. The sky darkened quickly. The chill of the air pressed deeper into her bones. She couldn't stop thinking about Kyle, about how, in that moment, he had been the son she raised, and now he was the man who'd discarded her like something unnecessary. She had always been his sounding board, his lifeline, the one who understood when nobody else did. And now, she was nothing to him. By the time night had fully fallen, Doris had lost track of the minutes. The streets grew quieter, the sound of passing cars muffled by the thickening snow. The weight of the world pressed on her chest, but there was no one to hear it. She felt as though she might disappear into the night, swallowed whole by the icy silence around her. And then, like a figure from nowhere, a man stepped into view. His silhouette was tall, broad, a denim jacket hanging loose around his frame. He was holding a thermos in his hand, steam rising from the top. "You look like you could use a hot drink," he said, his voice deep, steady. Doris blinked, taken by surprise. She hadn't noticed him approach. She must have looked a sight. Disheveled, shivering, lost. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. The man's eyes softened, his expression unreadable. "I'm not here to judge. Just thought you might like some coffee. No strings." She looked at the thermos, then at the man. Something about him felt different, calm, grounded, not like the chaos she had just walked out of. Maybe it was the gentleness in his offer, or maybe it was just the exhaustion wearing her down. But Doris found herself nodding. She took the thermos, uncapping it slowly. The warmth spread through her fingers, a small comfort in the cold, dark night. "Thank you," she said quietly. He smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "You need a ride somewhere? Anywhere?" Doris hesitated. There was nowhere she could go, but she couldn't stay here. Not like this. "Sure," she said finally. "I guess I could use a ride." The man nodded, then motioned for her to follow him. Doris followed, pulling the collar of her coat tighter around her neck, trying to steady herself. She could hear the soft crunch of snow beneath their boots as they walked to his truck. He opened the door for her, and she slid into the passenger seat, the warmth of the truck wrapping around her like a blanket. As she settled in, she noticed the stitching on the headrest, Noah Rains. The name felt like a revelation, a clue to something she couldn't yet piece together. But for now, it was enough to hold on to. "No strings," he'd said. And yet, in that moment, she felt something shift inside her. Something unexpected. Something she couldn't yet name. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end after all. The truck rumbled along a dirt road, its headlights cutting through the dark, thickening snow. Doris sat quietly, her hands cradling the thermos in her lap, still warm against the cold, as if the night were trying to freeze everything, her thoughts, her emotions, even the air around her. But Noah's truck was a small sanctuary, the interior lit only by the faint glow of the dashboard, casting long shadows across his face. He was focused on the road, but there was something about the way his shoulders were set that made her feel safe, for once. The wind howled outside as they took a sharp turn, the tires crunching through the snow, and then suddenly the truck slowed to a stop. A soft yellow light spilled from a small cabin ahead, its windows framed with a dusting of frost. There was something so simple about it. Almost too simple for someone like her. She didn't belong here, in this quiet little cabin, far from everything she knew. And yet, the prospect of it, the quiet, the warmth, the stillness, felt like the closest thing to peace she had had in months. Noah killed the engine, and the truck's low hum faded into the night. He turned to her, his gaze steady, but his expression unreadable. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said, his voice quiet, as though this was just another day, another guest. Doris hesitated. There were no questions, no expectations, no demands, just the offer of a place to rest, a safe space in the cold, a kindness she hadn't known she'd needed until now. She nodded, still processing. The cabin was small but comfortable, rustic in a way that felt natural. Wooden beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and the scent of pine and clean linen lingered in the air. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a warm, golden light on everything around her. A small kitchen, a neatly made bed, a bookshelf lined with well-worn books. There was no sign of clutter, no reminders of the chaos she'd left behind. It was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Doris felt the tight knot in her chest loosen ever so slightly. Noah set the thermos down on the counter and turned toward her, his voice kind but firm. I'll get you settled. There's food in the fridge, and anything you need, just ask. Thank you, she said softly. She could feel the exhaustion setting in, her body weighed down by the events of the day, by everything she hadn't had the chance to process. As she unpacked her small bag, something stirred deep inside her, a thought that had been trying to break free all evening. Her son, Kyle. She had to know what he was doing, where he was, what he'd said to anyone who might care. She needed to know if he was spreading lies. She needed to know if he was rewriting their story. She pulled out her phone and scrolled, but there was nothing. No service. Of course, there wouldn't be. Noah reappeared, this time with a small tray of sandwiches and a cup of tea. He set it on the table without saying a word, watching her with the same measured calm. She realized she hadn't eaten in hours, maybe longer, but she didn't have an appetite. Not yet. Instead, she sat down and picked up the old, leather-bound journal she'd kept with her for years. It had been part of her routine, writing things down, organizing her thoughts, capturing moments. The phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled with it, pulling it out to see an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Jamie. She didn't hesitate. She opened the message. "Where are you?" For a moment, Doris froze, staring at the simple, stark question. She should have answered, "I'm fine. I'm okay." But instead, she typed something more honest, more raw, though she knew she couldn't send it. "Not yet." "I don't know." She slid the phone back into her pocket and looked up at the cabin's simple, peaceful interior. As if to distract herself, she wandered over to the bookshelf. It wasn't much. Just a few rows of books, some outdated, some looking like they hadn't been touched in years. She ran her fingers over the spines, stopping when she noticed a file on the bottom shelf. It was wedged between two thick volumes of old manuals, its edge sticking out like it was waiting to be discovered. Curious, Doris pulled it out. The file was heavy, the paper inside thick with age. She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing over the first page. Rains Holdings, client list. Her heart skipped. On the first page was Kyle's company. The name, the logo, the address, everything, listed there in black and white. A piece of Kyle's world, his empire, under the control of Noah Rains. She didn't even realize she'd been holding her breath until she let it out in a slow, controlled exhale. Kyle had no idea. Not yet. Doris closed the file slowly, the weight of it sinking in. She didn't know how long she sat there, the fire crackling softly in the background, the world outside quiet, untouched by the chaos she'd just left behind. The file was real, and Noah's connection to Kyle's business, his power, was undeniable. She felt something stir within her, something that had been dormant for far too long, a quiet resolve. She wasn't sure where this road was going, but she knew one thing. She would not be the one left in the cold again. Not this time. The next morning, Doris woke to the soft crackle of the fire still glowing in the hearth. The cabin was quiet, but it felt alive in a way that the cold, sterile house she'd left behind never had. The room was filled with the scent of wood and warmth, a comfort she hadn't realized she was craving until it was already here. She stood, stretching, letting her feet settle into the thick rug by the bed. The light from the window was soft, the snow outside now just a blanket of white beneath a pale gray sky. Everything seemed to have slowed down, as if the world was waiting for her to catch up. Noah's truck was gone, and the silence in the cabin felt almost sacred. There was a calmness that settled around her, but it was tempered with the undercurrent of her own thoughts. The file, Kyle's company, Rains Holdings. She could almost feel the weight of it sitting at the back of her mind, a door she hadn't yet fully opened. But for now, she pushed it aside. She had a chance to breathe, to think. For the first time in what felt like forever, Doris had space to be something other than the mother who had been betrayed, the woman left out in the cold. She was Doris Blackwell again. And that mattered. Later that morning, after a quiet breakfast of toast and coffee, she found Noah back at the shop. He was busy organizing boxes in the back, moving with a sure, steady motion that spoke of years of experience. The shop was small but meticulously kept, clean and well-maintained just like the cabin. It was as if Noah knew the value of order in a world that often felt chaotic. Doris stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him before stepping in. "Need any help?" she asked, her voice steady, though her words felt strange. She was offering help when, for so long, it was help she had needed. Noah looked up, raising an eyebrow, but there was no hesitation in his response. "Sure, if you don't mind." It didn't take long for her to get to work. She knew systems, knew how to bring order to chaos. Her mind clicked into gear the moment she started sorting through the boxes, labeling them with precision, creating an inventory system that was simple but effective. Noah was quiet as he watched her work, and there was a part of her that almost forgot the weight of the world outside this small room. The past felt distant, but the present, this moment, felt solid beneath her hands. As the day stretched on, Doris found herself lost in the task, her mind focused, her movements fluid and sure. Noah seemed content to let her go at her own pace, occasionally offering a quiet word of approval or asking if she needed anything. And when the labels were done, when the system was set up, Doris felt a satisfaction that she hadn't realized she was missing. It wasn't just the work. It was the sense of purpose, of competence. She wasn't someone to be discarded. She wasn't the mother whose only value was in the service she provided. She was more than that. Noah seemed to understand that, too. Later, after the work was done, Doris offered to cook. It was the least she could do, after all. She didn't have much else to offer, but she could cook. A skill her son had never truly appreciated, despite all the meals she'd made him over the years. Noah's staff was small, just a few workers coming in and out of the shop. But they seemed grateful when Doris placed a hearty stew on the counter with warm bread and butter. As they ate, one of the men gave her a smile, the kind of smile that seemed to come from someone who had tasted something rare. "Nobody cooks like this anymore," he said, voice thick with appreciation. Doris smiled, but there was something sad behind her eyes. She had been a mother, a wife, a woman who had dedicated herself to making others comfortable. And here, in this small town, she was reminded that the most basic things, like a good meal, could make a person feel seen, truly seen. Later that evening, when the work was done, when the shop was quiet and the air felt thick with the kind of silence only the end of a long day could bring, Doris sat at the small kitchen table with Noah. The fire crackled softly in the background as she began to jot something down in her journal, the pen moving steadily across the page. She had started a new entry, a new chapter. After I was dropped. It was a story she had never intended to write, but it was one she would finish. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from Jamie, and the question was simpler. What happened? Doris stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. She didn't have an answer. She didn't know what had happened yet. What had been done to her was still too raw, too new. But she would find out. She would learn everything, piece by piece. Noah appeared beside her, looking over her shoulder at the journal. He didn't ask what she was writing. He didn't need to. He simply poured 2 glasses of wine, the amber liquid catching the light from the fire. Doris took the glass, but she didn't drink. Not yet. She looked up at Noah, something shifting in her chest, a quiet, deliberate decision being made. "You ever want to ruin someone legally?" she asked. her voice calm but carrying the weight of something deeper. Noah's eyes darkened just for a second before he smiled, slow and knowing. "Sometimes," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I don't make a habit of it." She wasn't sure if she believed him, but the smile he gave her felt like a promise, a dangerous one. For the first time since she had stepped into this world of silence and snow, Doris felt a flicker of something inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. Doris sat at the kitchen table, the last of the evening light casting soft shadows across the room. The fire in the hearth had long since faded to embers, and the only sound was the occasional shift of wood settling. The cabin, though small and simple, felt like a haven compared to the hollow void she'd left behind in Boise. But even here, in the quiet, the weight of Kyle's betrayal pressed heavily against her chest. The phone buzzed again. Jamie, this time with a forwarded email. Doris reached for it, her heart picking up speed. It was a financial report from Kyle's company, the sort of thing Jamie had access to in her position within the HR department. She scrolled through the numbers, her brows knitting together. The discrepancies were glaring. Tax filings missing, employee benefits incorrectly listed, and, at the center of it all, overstated profits that didn't match the books. Doris set the phone down, her fingers still trembling with the shock of it. This wasn't just sloppy management. This was deliberate. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Noah. He was standing there, a folder in hand, a look in his eyes that was both businesslike and cautious. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the door closing softly behind him. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone measured but sharp. "I want you to help with something." Doris looked up from the phone, surprised but intrigued. "Help?" Noah handed her the folder, his eyes flicking briefly to the fire before meeting her gaze. "Process consultant, for my subsidiary. You've got experience, Doris. I've seen the work you did here, and it's exactly what I need for the business side of things." Doris blinked. "You want me to work for you?" Noah nodded. "Yes. The subsidiary handles a lot of logistics for companies in our group, but it's a mess. I need someone to step in, review workflows, streamline operations, and fix what's been broken for years." His eyes darkened slightly. What Kyle never noticed. Her breath caught in her throat. The idea of diving back into work, into something so far from the world she'd once known with Kyle, was foreign. But the offer was real. The power it promised was real. "I'm not sure what you mean by fixing," Doris said slowly, the remnants of doubt still clinging to her words. Noah's voice was quiet but firm. "You're good at what you do, Doris. You see things others don't. I don't need someone to take orders. I need someone who understands what's broken and can put it back together." He paused, letting the silence settle. "You're not just a mother, Doris. You're someone with expertise, with vision. I need that." For a long moment, Doris said nothing, turning over the offer in her mind. The words felt heavy, too heavy to lift immediately, but she felt it, an ember of something inside her, growing a little warmer. "Let me think about it," she said, her voice low but steady. "I'll let you know." Noah didn't press. He simply nodded and turned to leave, but before he stepped out the door, he paused. "And Doris," he added quietly, "you're not alone in this. We'll do this together, at your pace." That was the moment it hit her. This wasn't just an offer to fix someone else's broken systems. It was an invitation to rebuild. Hers. Her world. Her life. The next morning, Doris sat down at the desk by the window, the folder Noah had given her open in front of her. She had spent the entire night reading through it. Notes, projections, strategies. And now, with the morning light flooding the room, her mind was clear. The fear, the uncertainty, The frustration, all of it was still there. But there was something else now. A sharp focus, a purpose. She was no longer just reeling from betrayal. She was seeing a way forward, a way to take back control. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Marla, her old friend and legal confidant. I pulled Kyle's company records. His books are sloppy, and his audits are worse. It's a mess, Doris. You were right to question the numbers. Doris closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of her decision pressing in on her chest. She had trusted Kyle for so long, trusted him to do right by her, by their family. And now? Now she was about to bring everything he had built to its knees. But this was no longer about Kyle, it was about her, about rebuilding, about using the tools she had long ignored, the tools he had taken for granted. She felt the old journal beside her. After I was dropped, and a quiet thrill stirred within her. She had been broken, but now she was putting herself back together. As the days stretched on, Doris made the decision. She would take Noah's offer. She would rebuild not just his company, but her own legacy. There was power in this, power she had forgotten she possessed. Later that afternoon, Noah returned, his face lighting up with a rare, approving smile when he saw the look on her face. "I've made my decision," Doris said, her voice steady and calm. "I'll do it. I'll help with the logistics. I'll fix what needs fixing." Noah's eyes sparkled with a quiet approval. He didn't say anything immediately, just handed her a letter. She opened it, transferring authority. It was official now. She wasn't just a consultant. She was the compliance liaison for Rain's Holdings, for the company that owned Kyle's business. And with that, Doris felt a small, dangerous smile creep onto her face. She wasn't just a spectator anymore. She was in the game. As the door clicked shut behind Noah, Doris sat down, pulling her journal toward her. She began writing, the pen moving across the page with ease. Infrastructure of revenge. It's time to rebuild. The pieces were falling into place now. And Kyle? He had no idea what was coming. The first quarterly review she attended was silent as a wolf in the snow. Doris had joined the call under a fake name, her real identity shielded by Noah's insistence on secrecy. Her voice was a whisper in the ear of the system. She wasn't there physically, but she was there in every way that mattered. She clicked her pen methodically as Kyle's voice boomed across the line, his smug confidence unmistakable. "Gentlemen, we've never been tighter operationally. The numbers speak for themselves. We're at our best, and we're just getting started." His words washed over Doris, thick with arrogance and the weight of someone who had never been challenged. He was convinced of his invincibility, of his superiority. Doris could feel the quiet rage building in her, the kind that had been smothered by years of service and sacrifice, waiting for the perfect moment to surface. She listened, taking meticulous notes, capturing every word, every misstep. And there it was, the crack in the armor. Kyle had always been careless, never noticing the details, never concerned with the threads hanging loose. Doris marked 3 major contract violations, each one an unintentional key to his undoing. She clicked the send button on the email, her hand steady, as the violations were forwarded to Noah, the breach now officially documented. The conversation droned on, with Kyle's inflated self-worth taking center stage. But Doris wasn't listening to him anymore. She had already checked out, her mind running ahead. She thought of the file in her journal, Infrastructure of Revenge. It was already taking shape, each little action falling into place. A few hours later, her phone buzzed. It was Jamie. "Kyle's expense reports came through. You were right. They're a mess." Doris felt her stomach tighten as she opened the message. Attached were receipts, thousands of dollars spent on lavish dinners, corporate retreats, and lavish personal luxuries. Kyle had built his empire on the backs of others, squandering company funds on things that never mattered, things that he believed no one would ever question. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of everything they had built, everything they had stolen pressing down on her chest. This was no longer about the company, about profits or losses. This was about something far deeper. It was about justice, about putting an end to the years of neglect and greed. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a plan coming together. The next day, Doris stood in front of the board, though they didn't know it yet. Her recommendation was final, her voice soft but firm on paper. Temporary Leadership Contingency Recommendation. It was the kind of memo that made small men like Kyle sweat, the kind that lived in the undercurrent of corporate power plays. She had written it in secret, just as she had everything else. Noah forwarded it to the board, bypassing Kyle entirely. As she sat back in her small office, the feeling of power, subtle and intoxicating, crept in again. The game was unfolding, just as she had planned. The players didn't know it yet, but they were already too far in to turn back. Noah called her later that afternoon. His voice was calm, but there was something else underneath it, a tension she hadn't noticed before. It's been sent. We'll see how long it takes Kyle to notice. He didn't need to say more. They both knew what was coming. Doris smiled, a small, slow curve of her lips. She wasn't just a spectator anymore. She had become the architect of Kyle's undoing. The following weeks were a quiet storm. Doris continued to attend quarterly reviews, her name still hidden behind a veil of secrecy, but her presence was undeniable. She marked flaws, identified inconsistencies, and sent her findings to Noah with an eerie precision. Kyle, in his usual arrogance, barely noticed the changes. He simply assumed the company was running smoothly, that his leadership was flawless. Amanda, ever the perfect corporate spouse, posted a photo online one afternoon with the caption, "Supporting strong leaders is what marriage is about." She had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, no idea that her husband's empire was crumbling from the inside. The threads were unraveling fast. Doris had become a quiet force, invisible to everyone but Noah. But she was everywhere. She was in every meeting Kyle led, every contract he signed, every decision he made. She was the silent observer, the calm before the storm. But Doris knew something that Kyle didn't. Power wasn't in the loudest voice in the room. It wasn't in the aggressive moves of a man who had been coddled and praised his entire life. Power was in the quiet. It was in the patience of someone who had seen the game for what it truly was. And as the final pieces of her plan clicked into place, Doris knew she was just getting started. The memo was only the beginning. The storm was coming. Kyle had no idea how badly it would hit. As the last of the quarterly meetings wrapped up, Doris leaned back in her chair, eyes flicking over the latest emails. The pieces were all falling into place. Now, the real game was about to begin. The quiet of Doris's new office was almost unnerving at times. It was spacious, clean, and lined with shelves, each neatly stacked with files that cataloged her every step, every decision, every transaction, every small betrayal that had led her to this moment. It had taken her weeks to build her personal archive, every debt owed to her by Kyle, by Amanda, by the company they had built together. Some were financial, others emotional. Many, both. And now, with meticulous precision, Doris had compiled them all into a thick binder, a record of everything that had been taken from her, everything that had been overlooked, ignored, and dismissed. She had kept track of it all, from the smallest slight to the most egregious betrayal. Kyle had used her retirement savings to start his business. He had always promised he would repay her. But that promise was never honored. Not a penny returned, not even a token gesture of gratitude. The quiet anger that had been simmering inside her for years was now a clear, calculated understanding. Kyle had always viewed her as a resource to exploit, a means to an end. And now Doris was documenting it all. No longer just the quiet mother, the one who had been left in the cold. Now she was the one who would make sure the world knew what had been taken from her. But it wasn't just about money. It was about everything else. The emotional debts, the years of her life spent in service to her son's ambition, the time she had sacrificed, believing she was doing the right thing, the love she had poured into her family only to be discarded like a worn-out tool. Amanda's name appeared in her records as well, scrawled across several pages. $18,000 for a consulting rebrand. Amanda had borrowed the money years ago, promising to pay it back when the business took off. The check had never come. Doris knew she was not alone in her bitterness. Amanda had never given a second thought to the cost of her actions, the price others had paid for her privilege. Doris's hand trembled slightly as she turned the page. She had kept the emails, the messages, the receipts, all neatly categorized under unreturned investments. These were debts Amanda would never have acknowledged had it not been for Doris's careful attention. It was Marla who had helped Doris organize everything. Her friend, the retired paralegal, had long been a steady presence in Doris's life, offering counsel and support when Doris needed it most. Together, they had gone through the records, sorted the details, and created a comprehensive file of everything Doris had given, and everything that had never been returned. When Doris opened the file from Marla, there was one more document that caught her eye, a spreadsheet from Kyle. She hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated finding it in the midst of her organized chaos. It was simple. One line at the top that read, "Cut off mom this year." Beneath it, there were bullet points of his reasons, the calculations of his decisions to sever all financial ties with her. It was cold, clinical, nothing more than a business transaction to Kyle. Doris printed the spreadsheet immediately. She didn't think twice. The ink was fresh on the page as she framed it, the harsh words now immortalized, a constant reminder of the man her son had become. She pinned it above her desk, next to the window. It was now her reality. Kyle's betrayal wasn't something she could escape. It was something she would face every day until the end. It wasn't just a reminder. It was a marker. A point in time where everything had shifted. Doris was no longer just a mother who had been pushed aside. She was now a force to be reckoned with. And then, one morning, Amanda walked into the company building. Doris had known the day would come. It wasn't the first time Amanda had been in the building since Doris had assumed a more powerful position, but today felt different. There was a shift in the air, something almost tangible. Amanda, always impeccable in her appearance, entered the lobby as if nothing had changed, as if the world were still turning on her terms. But as she passed through the glass doors, her eyes caught something. A nameplate above one of the offices. The name, boldly printed in black on a brushed silver plaque. Doris Blackwell. Amanda's face froze for just a moment. That was all it took. The realization sank in. Doris watched from her office window, her gaze steady, unwavering. She had no need to make her presence known. She didn't need to confront Amanda directly, not yet. The message had already been sent. Doris had built her own space now, and Amanda knew exactly what it meant. The quiet satisfaction of the moment lingered, but Doris knew this was only the beginning. Amanda would react. Kyle would have no choice but to respond. And when the storm finally hit, Doris would be ready. She looked up at the framed spreadsheet once more, the one Kyle had written, the one that showed exactly how he had decided to cut her off. And for a brief, fleeting moment, a dangerous thought crossed her mind. Let him come. It was time for the real reckoning to begin. The boardroom was cold, as it always was, the glass walls reflecting the sterile perfection of the corporate world Kyle had built. The long, polished table stretched out before him, a reminder of all he had achieved, and, in this moment, a reminder of all he had taken for granted. He stepped into the room with a confidence that still clung to him like a second skin, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. But as his eyes scanned the table, something shifted in the air. It wasn't just the presence of the board members, seated like statues around him. It was the quiet shift of authority that suddenly felt too heavy, too weighty. Doris Blackwell was sitting in his seat. The chair he had once occupied with his smug, self-assured air now cradled her in quiet defiance. Her presence was calm, collected, as though she had always belonged here. Beside her sat Noah, his expression unreadable, his gaze focused but intense. Kyle paused for a moment in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. It took a beat longer than usual for him to shake off the confusion and gather himself. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to make his move. He cleared his throat and straightened his tie. "Doris," he began, his voice faltering only slightly. "I didn't expect this." Doris didn't look up at him immediately. She was busy shuffling a few papers, reviewing a set of notes with deliberate calm. When she finally raised her eyes to meet his, there was no warmth there, only a cool, deliberate assessment. "We'll be evaluating compliance today," she said, her tone a soft but firm command. No malice, no arrogance, just business. Kyle's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked to Noah, who remained silent beside her. The tension in the room thickened like a storm cloud, but Noah didn't offer any reassurance, didn't say a word. He was a silent observer, just as Doris had been in those many years of watching him call the shots. Kyle stammered, his usual self-assurance unraveling. I wasn't informed of any changes to the agenda." His gaze darted nervously as though expecting someone, anyone, to come to his rescue. But the room remained still, the board members silently waiting for something to unfold. Jamie, sitting at the back, clicked through a slide deck with a practiced hand, each slide lighting up the screen with hard, cold facts. The violations were methodically presented, one after another. Financial discrepancies, false reports, contract breaches. No emotion, just numbers, just the cold truth. Doris watched as Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushed. He was being dismantled, piece by piece, by the weight of his own mistakes, and yet he had no idea how to fight back. He had always relied on his charm, his power, his control. But today, it was all crumbling in front of him, and he had nothing to hold on to. The meeting continued, each slide of the presentation a knife twisting deeper into the corporate empire Kyle had built. Doris stayed calm, her eyes fixed on the screen, though she could feel Kyle's gaze on her. It was a stare that demanded an answer, but there was none to give. The truth was plain. Kyle was done. The phone on the table buzzed, and Amanda's name flashed across the screen. The sharp vibration broke through the tension in the air. Doris didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone and glanced at the call for a split second before declining it, her fingers swift across the screen. The room was too quiet, too pregnant with expectation. Amanda was probably wondering what her husband was doing, why the meeting was taking this unexpected turn. But Doris had no time to answer her questions. Not today. Marla's voice suddenly cut through the stillness, crisp and efficient, as a courier entered the room carrying a large box. He walked straight to the front, handing it over to Doris without a word. She took it, slowly, deliberately, as all eyes turned toward her. The box was marked in bold black letters, "Restitution." Kyle's eyes widened in disbelief. He knew exactly what that meant. He had always thought that his wealth, his influence, would shield him from accountability. But today, in this room, It was all coming to an end. Every lie, every betrayal was now being held in that box, and there was no escaping it. Doris set the box down on the table, her hand resting on it with quiet authority. She didn't need to open it. It wasn't for her to see, it was for them. She could feel Kyle's eyes burning into her, but she didn't flinch. He had made his decisions, and now it was time to face the consequences. "Are you ready to make things right, Kyle?" Doris asked, her voice soft but carrying a sharp edge. "Or do we continue with the financial review?" The room held its breath. Kyle's face had gone pale. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the table, trying to maintain his composure. But it was clear. His empire was no longer his to command. The board members exchanged quick, furtive glances. They knew what had been happening behind the scenes. They had seen the financial records, the violations, the manipulation. Kyle's time was up. Noah didn't speak. He didn't need to. He was there, as always, to watch Doris do what she had set out to do. She was the one who had built this moment, the one who had controlled the game from the shadows. With a single glance from Doris, the vote was called. The board, after a brief and tense pause, voted to suspend Kyle, pending a full financial review. Kyle stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was a mask of shock and fury. "This isn't over, Doris," he spat, but there was no conviction in his words. He was already defeated. Doris didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply watched him as he stormed out of the room, the echoes of his departure carrying the finality of everything that had been set in motion. When the door clicked shut behind him, Doris allowed herself a breath, a small release of tension. She had won. And Kyle? He was no longer the one in control. It had all been leading to this. The morning after the board meeting, the weight of the decision settled heavily on Doris's shoulders. She was no longer merely an observer, no longer an afterthought. She had crossed the line into real power, into a role she had once only imagined from the periphery. Now, the reins were in her hands. The division Kyle had run, the one he had built to feed his ego and his bank account, was now under her control. She took a moment to sit in the sleek leather chair he had once occupied, her fingers tracing the edge of the desk. It felt surreal. His legacy was now hers to dismantle and rebuild. She had 90 days to make it hers, to shift the company from the selfish empire he had constructed into something sustainable, something that worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. The first order of business was immediate: freeze all company cards. No more extravagant dinners, no more unchecked personal luxuries at the company's expense. Doris didn't care that Kyle had once justified those expenses under the guise of business relationships. It wasn't business. It was indulgence at others' expense. The perks were gone. She paused the bonuses for all top executives, cutting off the flow of easy money that had built an atmosphere of entitlement. She took a personal delight in restructuring the top-heavy contracts that had always favored those closest to Kyle. The ones who didn't question his decisions, the ones who had been blind to his manipulations. Now, those contracts would be fairer, transparent, built to protect the workers, the ones who had actually done the heavy lifting. And, for the first time, the workers knew they weren't invisible. Jamie, always loyal and efficient, worked beside her to rewrite HR policies. The new language was clear, simple. Caregivers, older workers, and those who had been overlooked in favor of youth and obedience, they would now be valued. It was a statement, a fundamental shift in the company's culture. One afternoon, Doris hosted a team lunch. It was quiet. No grand speeches, no forced pleasantries. Just a simple statement, as cold and direct as her gaze on the table. "We reward loyalty, not volume," she said, letting her words settle like stone in the room. The lunch continued in silence. The executives had no choice but to accept it. They were still stunned, still reeling from Kyle's downfall, and now they saw Doris for what she was, a force to be reckoned with. But Doris wasn't finished. The most satisfying moment of the day came when Amanda tried to enter the building. As she often did, her expensive clothes and polished demeanor making her presence known. It was always the same. Amanda strutted in like she owned the place, as though the company's success was built on her image alone. This time, Doris had something to say about it. Security stopped Amanda at the door. Her access badge no longer worked. It was a small thing, an almost imperceptible moment of triumph, but it hit Amanda hard. She didn't understand yet that her privileges were gone, stripped away, just like Kyle's. Doris watched from her office window as Amanda stood there, fumbling with the badge, trying to force it to work, trying to regain some semblance of control. It was futile. The security guard didn't budge. The building no longer belonged to them. Amanda's reaction would be a quiet storm, Doris knew. But the battle had already been won. Doris felt a small, satisfied smile tug at the corners of her lips. She wasn't just turning the company around, she was redefining it, reshaping it in a way that Kyle could never have imagined. His name, his influence, his unchecked reign, they were gone, swept aside by a mother who had once been dismissed, who had once been seen as insignificant. Now, she was the one making the decisions. And Kyle? He was on the outside trying to force his way back in, but the door was closed. Permanently. As Doris sat back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk, she knew something was shifting deep inside her. This was more than just a financial victory. It was personal. It was justice. And she would see it through to the end. No one would ever take her for granted again. Not her son. Not Amanda. Not anyone. The storm was far from over, but Doris was finally standing at the eye of it, and she was ready. The morning after the lunch with the team, Doris sat quietly in her office, watching the city skyline through the large windows. The world was moving around her, but in this moment it felt like she was standing still, gathering strength, letting the reality of her new life settle in. She had been thrust into power, not as a leader by choice, but by necessity. It had been weeks since she had taken control of Kyle's division, and already, the company was starting to shift. She could feel it in the way the employees looked at her now, the respect they hadn't shown her before. They were no longer whispering behind her back, no longer questioning her right to be here. Doris had earned it, not with loud speeches or grand gestures, but with calm, careful decisions and a quiet strength that came from years of being overlooked. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Marla. Doris picked up on the second ring. "You've made the news," Marla said, her voice light but edged with something that Doris couldn't quite place. The local news, that is. Doris raised an eyebrow, the smallest smile tugging at her lips. "What's it say?" Marla paused before replying. "They're calling you the woman behind the turnaround." Doris stood up and walked over to her desk, where a pile of papers waited for her attention. The turn of phrase wasn't lost on her. She wasn't just someone fixing mistakes. She was becoming the face of change, of something more meaningful than Kyle's empty promises. The article ran online shortly after, with a headline that made Doris's heart skip. "Rebuilt from nothing, the woman behind the turnaround." It was a clean, sharp profile of Doris, the unexpected leader. The first image in the article was a shot of her, standing tall and composed, with the corporate building in the background. She looked like the kind of woman who belonged here, the kind of woman who had always been here. But it was the photo of Kyle, blurred, barely recognizable, that caught Doris's eye. The camera had captured him, but only in the background, a faint figure in the haze of what had been his world. Amanda was nowhere to be found. Marla's voice echoed in her mind. Funny how quiet they get when you speak with proof. The piece was balanced, measured, and more telling than Doris had anticipated. Kyle's name appeared only once, and even then, it was a passing mention, a vague nod to his former leadership. Amanda was invisible, as though she had never been there to begin with. Doris didn't need to say anything to confirm the irony of it. The media had done the job for her. For once, the truth was out there, in black and white. The phone buzzed again, Jamie this time. Doris glanced at the message as it popped up on her screen. "You ready to speak with the press?" Jamie had asked it matter-of-factly. No hint of hesitation. Doris considered it for a moment, then shook her head, sending a quick response. "Not today." There was no need for her voice to echo across TV screens or the airwaves. The company had spoken for her. The article had painted the picture perfectly. Doris didn't need the noise. She didn't need to compete with the spectacle of Kyle's rise. She had already beaten him in silence. But that didn't mean the world wouldn't be watching. It wasn't long before Amanda posted her response to the article on her social media. The words were sharp, the image of her smiling at some charity gala perfectly posed. Jealousy is a sad motivator. Doris allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction before opening Jamie's message. "So is greed." Doris smiled at Jamie's blunt reply. She didn't need to say much more. The world was already seeing the difference between what Kyle and Amanda had built and what she was rebuilding. As Doris sat back in her chair, reflecting on everything that had led her to this point, she thought about the article's closing line. It was her own words, one she hadn't fully realized the weight of until now. "You don't have to yell, you just have to outlast them." She looked out the window, the skyline stretching out before her, and for the first time in years, Doris felt the weight of her decisions settle comfortably around her. This was just the beginning. Kyle may have once thought he could control everything, manipulate his way to the top. But Doris knew better. Power didn't reside in the loudest voice or the biggest ego. It didn't come from fleeting moments of glory. It came from resilience, from outlasting the ones who thought they could silence you, from making decisions that rippled through everything they had built. And now, Kyle would see. He wasn't just losing his position, he was losing everything. The envelope sat on Kyle's desk like a weight, an unexpected visitor that had no place in his world. He eyed it for a long moment, his fingers hovering over the seal. It was thick, official, too formal for a casual memo or a routine report. It was from Doris. He had expected something like this, but still, the feeling of dread that crept over him as he opened it made his hands tremble. He thought for a moment that maybe it was just a formality. Maybe she'd finally gotten around to giving him a severance package, just as he had expected, something to keep things neat and professional. He tore the envelope open with a sharp movement, and the first thing that fell out was a letter. "Official severance package," it read at the top, the words sterile and cold, almost mocking. Kyle's eyes skimmed the letter. It was minimal. Minimum severance, just as the law dictated. There was no personal touch, no remorse, just a number on the bottom line that didn't come close to the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. No golden parachute, no cushy exit. Just a number. He felt his stomach tighten as he pulled out the next piece of paper. It was a grocery ledger, a simple one from years ago. The kind of thing Doris used to keep track of their household spending. An old habit, a relic from a time when their world had been simpler. But there was something different about this one. The neat rows of dates and items had been annotated in her familiar handwriting, but now, under each meal, each grocery trip, was a small note. Every meal, every ride, every favor. Kyle felt his pulse quicken. These weren't just the mundane details of daily life. These were receipts for his actions, each one a little debt, each one a tally of everything she had given him and never been repaid. He could see the times she had driven him to meetings when he was too busy to think, the groceries she had bought when the business was just starting out. He remembered each moment, but he hadn't thought of it like this. He turned the page, his hands shaking as he went through the items, the favors, the countless hours she had put into making sure his life was easier, his business more successful. The annotations were a reminder, sharp and cutting, of just how much Doris had given and how little she had received in return. The next thing he pulled from the envelope was a second letter. This one was addressed to Amanda. Amanda's name was in bold at the top of the letter, and Kyle felt a pang in his chest as he realized the contents were far worse than he'd anticipated. As he began to read, the words blurred together. It was a full itemized repayment demand, every cent accounted for, every loan Amanda had taken from Doris over the years. No flexibility, no forgiveness, just cold, hard numbers. Amanda had always thought she could slip through unnoticed, but now, just like him, she would face the consequences of her actions. The feeling of betrayal that had marked Doris's life was now coming for them both. Kyle shoved the letters back into the envelope, his hands trembling, his mind racing. He couldn't believe it. He hadn't expected Doris to strike back like this, hadn't expected her to have such cold, calculated precision. And then he saw it. A final note, scrawled at the bottom of the page in Noah's handwriting. You burned your bridge. She paved hers. Kyle's breath caught. The implication was clear. Noah had been in on it all along. It wasn't just Doris he had to answer to now. It was the entire network of people she had quietly, but steadily, built around her. Before he could absorb the weight of it, his phone buzzed. It was Doris's name flashing across the screen. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone. He should answer. He needed to hear her voice, confront her, try to talk his way out of this. But his thumb hovered over the screen, his pulse thudding louder in his ears. He couldn't take it. Not today. The phone stopped ringing. He had blocked it. Kyle cursed under his breath, his anger swelling in his chest. He punched the desk in frustration, but there was no use. He was done. This was it. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. A notification popped up on his phone, an email from Jamie. He opened it, his eyes scanning the screen. It was a new contract offer, consulting work for a national firm, a fresh start, a new beginning. But then, just as quickly as he had read it, the last line caught his eye. Doris had written something on the page. It wasn't a note or a request. It was just one word: declined. He let the phone fall onto the desk, the sound of the impact sharp in the silence. It was over. Completely. Kyle wasn't just losing control of the company anymore. He was losing everything: his family, his future, his place in the world. And Doris? Doris had already moved on. She had rebuilt herself from nothing. And now, it was clear, she was the one who had truly won. As the last shred of his empire crumbled away, Kyle finally understood the one thing Doris had been trying to teach him all along. It wasn't about fighting. It was about outlasting. And she had done it. The finality of Doris's resignation settled over the company like a soft fog. Her contract had been fulfilled, the turnaround complete. And with it, her role as the leader of this fractured empire had come to an end. The air in her office, which had once been filled with the hum of purpose, now felt quieter. There was a weight to it that wasn't entirely comforting, but it was a weight she had earned. She sat at her desk one last time, her fingers brushing across the contract, now signed and finalized. Her departure was by design, timed for the moment when everything had been set in motion, when the company was on a clear path forward. She had rebuilt, refocused, and reshaped this company into something ethical, something sustainable. And now, It was time to leave it in hands more capable than hers, Noah's and Jamie's. They would carry the torch forward, building on the foundation Doris had laid. But before she left, there was something else to do. The ceremony to unveil the new name of the building was modest, intentionally so. But it carried the weight of transformation. Blackwell Center for Ethical Logistics. It was a subtle nod to the past, but it was a definitive statement about the future. Doris's future. And the future of everyone who had worked tirelessly for what had once been a company built on egos and lies. Noah stood beside her as they unveiled the plaque. The crowd was small but meaningful. Employees who had weathered the storm with her, workers who had bought into her vision. She could see the pride in their eyes, the respect she had earned. But then there was Amanda, seated on the edge of the gathering, looking like a stranger in the room. She had come uninvited, of course, hoping to make some gesture, to slip back into the limelight of the company she had once felt entitled to. Doris didn't acknowledge her. She didn't have to. The camera flashes from the press gathered around the event didn't touch her. They lingered on Amanda, searching for a reaction. But there was no place for Amanda in this new chapter. No place for the entitlement she had thrived on. She was the ghost of the company's past, just like Kyle. Jamie stood at the podium, poised and calm, delivering the dedication speech. She wasn't saved. She rerouted, Jamie said, her voice steady, resonating with the clarity of truth. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Doris felt something stir within her. She wasn't a savior. She was a builder, a creator. She had taken what was broken and rebuilt it from the ground up. That was the true measure of her strength. Marla, standing quietly in the back, her Rolodex still intact and her influence undeniable, approached Doris afterward. She placed a small, heavy object into Doris's hands. It was an engraved compass, a small silver thing with intricate markings on the back. "For when you need direction, my dear," Marla said with a knowing smile. Doris turned the compass over in her hands, her fingers tracing the engraving, "Find your north." It was a simple message, but it resonated deep within her. She had found her way, her purpose. And now she would guide others, just as she had been guided by her own resilience. The event was winding down. But there was a moment outside the building that felt almost cinematic, the end of an era for one person and the beginning of something new for another. Doris stepped out to the front steps, where she had once stood on the other side of the glass, looking in. She was greeted by the soft hum of the city as it passed by, oblivious to the changes she had just made. And then, she saw him, Kyle's car, slow and deliberate, coming to a stop just at the curb. He didn't get out of the car. He didn't have to. Doris knew what he was thinking, the same thing he had always thought, that somehow he was still in control, even as the world around him had fallen apart. Doris watched him for a long moment, his face partially visible through the tinted window. She saw the anger, the disbelief. She saw the shadow of defeat he couldn't shake. But she didn't move. She didn't acknowledge him with even a glance. The past was no longer her concern. A reporter, one of the few who had stuck around, approached her. "Doris," he asked, his voice respectful but probing. "What was your first thought after they left you?" Doris didn't need to pause to think. The answer was simple, already formed in her mind. She smiled faintly, the weight of everything that had led her to this moment washing over her. "That they made it easier," she said, her voice steady but cutting through the air like a quiet sword. She didn't need to scream to make her point. Kyle, still sitting in his car, didn't get out. His empire was crumbling, but he couldn't bring himself to face her, not after everything he had done. Doris had outlasted him, outlasted all of them, and now she was free. Doris stood on the stage at the local community center, her hands steady as she addressed the small but eager crowd. The room was filled with women, women who had once been overlooked, cast aside or silenced by a world that valued youth and beauty over experience and wisdom. They were the ones who had been told they were too old, too tired, too outdated to make a difference in the workplace. But Doris saw their potential. And now, with the launch of her mentorship fund for displaced older women, she was giving them the chance to rise again, just as she had. The fund was designed to help women find new careers, to guide them through the challenges of reintegration into the workforce after years of being disregarded. "What you bring to the table is invaluable," Doris said, her voice resonating with conviction. "You are not yesterday's news. You are the foundation of what's next, and together, we will show the world what happens when experience is allowed to lead." The room erupted into applause. Doris felt a warmth in her chest, the kind of fulfillment that only comes from giving back what had been taken. She had built this program not only out of gratitude, but out of a deep understanding of what it felt like to be invisible, to be ignored. Jamie stood beside her, a quiet but unwavering support. She had become co-director of the mentorship program, her own dedication to the cause, unmistakable. And the program? It was a success beyond anything Doris had expected. The first class was already booked out through next year. It was no longer just an idea. It was a movement. But not everyone was so happy with Doris's success. Amanda, seething from her disappearance from the corporate limelight, had decided to take action. She filed a lawsuit against Doris, claiming public defamation, a final attempt to strike back at the woman who had upended everything she held dear. The news came in a simple email, its subject line stark: Amanda Blackwell, v. Doris Blackwell, lawsuit for defamation. Doris read the email, her expression unreadable. She didn't feel anger or frustration. Instead, she felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. Amanda had no real grounds for the suit. The evidence was stacked against her. It wasn't defamation, it was simply the truth. The case was dismissed within a matter of weeks. Amanda's voice, once so sure and powerful, now sounded like a distant echo in the background of Doris's life. The courtroom decision was swift, with no media circus or fanfare. It was just another small defeat for Amanda, a reminder that her time was up. And then, there was Kyle. Doris had heard whispers that he was trying to make a comeback of his own. Desperate to regain some control over his life, he applied for a job in Nevada. But the background checks, thorough and unyielding, unearthed the flaws in his past, the inconsistencies, the half-truths, the illegal maneuvers. All of it was laid bare. He was turned down. Again. Doris heard the news through Marla, whose Rolodex had connections everywhere. "He tried, Doris. He really did. But it's over," Marla said, her voice thick with both amusement and disbelief. Doris sat in her office as the news sank in, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Kyle had spent so long trying to climb and claw his way to the top, but now the walls were closing in on him, just as they had for Amanda. His name, his influence, it was all fading away. And for Doris, that fading was its own brand of victory. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from the city council. She opened it, and her breath caught. Doris Blackwell, awarded Community Citation for Ethical Leadership. The citation was for her work turning the company around, for her relentless pursuit of fairness, for creating an environment where ethics mattered more than profit margins. It was a recognition she never would have imagined receiving before. But here it was, the final acknowledgement of everything she had fought for. She let the email linger for a moment before forwarding it to Jamie. They had both worked tirelessly for this moment, and now it was theirs. Doris had built something she could be proud of. Something that would stand long after she was gone. Marla called later that afternoon. "You didn't just survive, Doris," she said, a note of pride in her voice. "You ran the audit." Doris laughed softly, a sound that seemed to surprise her. It wasn't a laugh of triumph. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was simply the recognition of how far she had come. "All I did was keep the receipts," she said, her voice tinged with quiet amusement. The laughter faded, but the sense of completion lingered. Doris had started with nothing but her resolve, and now she was leaving behind a legacy, one that no one would be able to erase. Her name was on the building. Her name was on the policies. She had reshaped the future, not just for herself, but for others who had been silenced. As she looked out the window of her office one final time, her gaze sweeping over the city, she realized something she had never fully understood before. It wasn't just about turning the company around, it was about the people she had touched, the lives she had changed. Her legacy was built on more than just success. It was built on people. And Kyle? Well, he had built his empire on vanity and greed. Doris had built hers on the quiet power of resilience. And in the end, that made all the difference. The story was hers now, and the world had no choice but to listen. The company's holiday photo shoot was one of the last remnants of an era Kyle and Amanda had dominated, a ritual they had once manipulated to cement their place at the helm. Doris didn't expect the scene to carry any special weight. But as she stood in front of the camera, her smile steady, her posture confident, she knew that this moment was hers and hers alone. She had taken everything they had built and turned it into something meaningful, something lasting. Jamie, with her usual precision, had organized the photo. She made sure Doris was front and center, as she should be. No longer was she the invisible mother on the sidelines. She was the face of the company now, strong, unyielding, the symbol of everything they had accomplished together. The lens captured the shift, the quiet revolution that had changed the corporate landscape. Once the photo was taken, the company holiday card went out, destined for 2,300 partners and vendors. There was one key difference this year: the footer, the part where Kyle and Amanda's names had once been proudly displayed as founders, was blank. The space was filled with a new title: Doris Blackwell, founder of Ethical Logistics. Simple, direct, and unambiguous. Doris didn't need to rub it in. But there was something deeply satisfying about knowing how the world would see this card. Later, Doris sent Marla a gift basket, her way of saying thank you for the years of friendship, for the guidance when it was needed most. She tucked a small card inside, her handwriting neat, the words precise. "Turns out, karma likes spreadsheets," it read. Marla would get the joke, but it wasn't just about revenge. It was about the quiet, inevitable way everything had fallen into place, about the recognition that Doris had made her mark, not just on the company, but on the very culture that had once crushed her. Amanda, of course, had tried to make a comeback. She showed up at a community panel, speaking about women's empowerment and business leadership. Her smile was practiced, forced, a mask she wore well, even as the whispers in the room grew louder. She didn't know it yet, but the room had already shifted. They were no longer listening to her words. They were waiting for her to fall. When she opened her mouth to speak, the coldness in the air was palpable. No one greeted her, no one engaged. Amanda had long since lost her audience. Her empire of influence had crumbled, and now, the void she had left behind felt strangely quiet. Later that day, Doris received her final bonus from Noah, a sum she had earned but had no use for. It was a token, a final acknowledgement of her work. But it didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a reminder of how far she had come. So, without hesitation, Doris donated the entire amount. She had nothing to prove anymore. She wasn't here for the accolades. She was here for the people, for the cause. But it was the Christmas card that caught Amanda by surprise. The one she had seen before, sent out to 2,300 partners and vendors. The one that featured Doris's confident smile front and center, framed in a moment of victory. When Amanda opened hers, the smile that stared back at her was unfaltering, unyielding. It wasn't just Doris's smile. It was a statement. A final statement. There was no room for Amanda in this new world. Her face had been wiped from the card, her name erased from the story. And Doris? Doris was framed in the center, the face of everything that had been rebuilt. The truth was in the details, in the small acts that spoke louder than any words ever could. Amanda stared at the card for a long moment, her fingers trembling as she set it down. The reality of what had happened was settling in, but it was too late to change anything. And as Doris stood in her office later that evening, looking out at the snow-covered streets, she knew one thing for certain. Her work wasn't done. There were still things to be built, lives to be touched, and legacies to create. Kyle and Amanda would fade into the background of her story, but her journey was just beginning. The Christmas card was more than just a holiday greeting. It was the mark of her transformation, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. And as Doris held her gaze steady on the horizon, she smiled, knowing that no one would ever forget who had rebuilt everything from the ground up. The storm had passed. Now it was her turn to thrive. The new house was smaller, quieter. Doris had intentionally chosen it for its simplicity. No shared walls, no echoing corridors of past lives and promises she could no longer afford to keep. The space was hers, and only hers. She had sold the larger home in Boise, the one where she had raised Kyle, where she had sacrificed so much. The house was a symbol of a life she had left behind, one she was no longer willing to inhabit. In the corner of the living room, a bookshelf was already lined with a few of her favorite books, neatly arranged. The walls, once bare, now held a few family photos, but nothing from her previous life. No reminders of the corporate world she had been thrust into and then walked away from. Here, in this small, quiet space, she found the peace she hadn't known she was searching for. Jamie visited often, every week without fail. They would bake together in the cozy kitchen, filling the house with the sweet smells of freshly baked bread, cookies, or whatever new recipe Doris had found to try. They would laugh over the simple things, plot out ideas for the mentorship program, and file away the paperwork for Doris's next big venture. There was always something to organize, something to create. But it wasn't the corporate paperwork anymore. It was something different. Something that mattered to Doris on a deeper level. "Your kitchen's got more heart than any office I've ever worked in," Jamie remarked one afternoon, sliding a batch of muffins out of the oven. Doris laughed, the sound coming more freely now. "Maybe, but I've got a lot more space to fill here." They settled at the small dining table with their tea and muffins, and Doris let the silence settle between them. She wasn't lonely in this quiet house. Far from it. She had built a life for herself again, a life that was entirely her own. Not long after, Doris received a call that made her pause. Her portrait had been added to the National Women in Logistics Hall of Fame. It was a recognition she had never sought, never expected. Yet, in some way, it felt like the final punctuation on the sentence of her reinvention. It was a quiet honor, but one that spoke volumes. Her work, her efforts to transform the industry, her refusal to be silenced by Kyle's betrayal, all of it had earned her this. She stood at the center of something larger than herself now, and it felt right. But she hadn't come this far just to be honored for the past. Doris wasn't finished, and neither was the world. As the months passed, Doris heard less and less of Kyle and Amanda. Their reputations, once gilded in the polished light of wealth and power, now seemed to whisper in the background. Kyle, now fully out of the picture, had tried, in vain, to rebuild his career in Nevada. He had applied for a job at a tech firm, but his past had caught up with him. A background check had exposed his shady dealings, and he had been rejected almost immediately. Amanda's name was no longer in the press either. She had tried to make a comeback, positioning herself as a champion for women's leadership, but the public had turned on her. The whispers that had once supported her were now gone, replaced by the realization that her brand of power was hollow. It wasn't long before even the most loyal followers had moved on. The city had moved on too. The stories of Kyle and Amanda had been replaced with new faces, new causes. Doris had long since learned not to look back. She had reclaimed her story, and now it was time for others to tell theirs. Marla called Doris one afternoon, asking her to attend a small retirement lunch. "Just 6 of us," she said. "Enough, right?" Doris smiled at the thought of the intimate gathering. It was the kind of lunch that didn't require speeches or fanfare. Marla, of course, would ensure everything was organized down to the smallest detail. It was the kind of lunch that felt like home. The day of the lunch arrived, and Doris dressed in simple clothes, a pair of slacks and a blouse that she had bought on a whim a few months ago. There was no need for expensive outfits anymore, no need to impress anyone. She had already done the work that mattered. At the restaurant, the small group gathered. There were no corporate suits or empty pleasantries. Just Marla, Jamie, and a few other longtime friends who had supported Doris through her quiet revolution. They talked about life, not business. They spoke about their children, their travels, their small victories. It was the kind of conversation Doris had longed for but never had time for. As the lunch wound down, Doris excused herself to the restroom. When she returned, there was a small envelope waiting at her seat. It was from Marla, as expected. Inside was Doris's final journal entry, a sentence written with the same clarity that had marked all her decisions. Drop doesn't mean done. It was simple. It was final. And it was everything Doris had learned over the years. Dropped. Discarded. Left behind. But it hadn't mattered. She had found her way again. She had fought through it all. And now, she had arrived. Later that evening, Doris sat at her desk, looking at the pile of papers that had accumulated over the years. As she prepared to leave the quiet home for a new venture, she did something that felt almost ceremonial. She filed the copyright for her memoir, her story, in her words. And as she placed the final document in the file, she smiled. Her legacy was no longer defined by the people who tried to tear her down. It was defined by the people she had uplifted, the lives she had touched, and the work she had built with her own hands. And now, she was ready to share it with the world. Her journey wasn't finished. It had only just begun. Doris's memoir, Dropped. The quiet power of being replaced and remembered hit shelves quietly, without the fanfare of a grand release party. But as the pages of the first printing filled bookstores, Doris knew it had its place. She had written it not as a story of triumph, but as a testament to what it meant to be overlooked, to be underestimated, and, ultimately, to rise. The book resonated with readers who had never heard their own struggles reflected in the mainstream narrative of corporate success. It wasn't about battling your way to the top. It was about surviving when the world had written you off. It was about taking control when everyone else had pushed you aside. Noah, who had been a quiet ally in Doris's transformation, wrote the introduction. His words were as sharp and clear as the principles they had built together. She taught us more in silence than most do with authority. The words felt like an echo of everything Doris had become. She had never screamed for attention. She had never chased glory. She had simply lived her truth, building something from the wreckage of her son's betrayal and the broken promises of a past life. And now, her company, the one she had rebuilt from the inside out, was standing at the top. It had topped the regional compliance charts, a beacon of ethical leadership in an industry that had once been rife with corruption and greed. Her name was synonymous with fairness, transparency, and integrity. The company was a reflection of her values, something the world could look to as a model for what business could be when it was done right. The success wasn't just financial. It wasn't about the numbers. It was about the culture. The shift in the hearts of the people who had once believed in nothing but profit. Jamie had been instrumental in this transformation, and now she was stepping into a leadership role herself. The first in her family to do so. Not because of who she was, but because of what she had achieved. Her merit spoke louder than any legacy handed down. And for Doris, seeing Jamie take the helm of her own future was a victory in itself. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about the next generation, about the legacy that would continue long after she was gone. Amanda, on the other hand, had faded. Her name no longer held the same weight it once had. She had attempted to reclaim a voice by speaking at a panel on women in leadership, but the world had moved on. The air around her had gone cold. Her words falling flat in a room that had already shifted away from her influence. The empire she had built on vanity had crumbled, and no one cared to listen anymore. One day, as Doris was strolling through a bookstore, she saw it, the familiar cover of her memoir on the bestseller shelf. It was an achievement, but not one she needed to celebrate. Instead, she simply stood there, gazing at it for a long moment. And then, Amanda walked in. Doris didn't know if she saw the book. She couldn't tell from where she stood, but Amanda lingered near the shelf, her fingers brushing the spines of the books. When she spotted the memoir, she picked it up, her eyes scanning the cover before she turned it backwards. It was a gesture full of pride, full of the old arrogance that she used to carry. But Doris didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply watched Amanda, the woman who had once tried to shape the world in her image, now confronted by the reality of someone else's story, someone else's success. Later that night, as Doris returned to her quiet home, she found a letter waiting for her on the kitchen counter. It was from a reader. "Thank you for teaching me how to stay upright." Doris read the letter twice, her fingers lingering over the words. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about lifting others up, showing them how to stand tall in the face of adversity, just as she had learned to do. The weight of that letter settled in her chest. This was her legacy. It wasn't just the corporate success or the accolades. It was the way she had touched lives, the way her story had become someone else's lifeline. As she sat back in her chair, Doris looked out the window at the quiet, snow-covered streets. She thought about everything she had lost and everything she had gained. Her journey wasn't just about getting back what had been taken from her. It was about building something stronger, something that couldn't be torn down again. Her son had pushed her out of the car, with no money, no resources, and no hope. And now, she had the wheel. She had taken everything he thought she couldn't touch and made it hers. Doris's final journal entry, written long ago, flickered in her mind. Dropped doesn't mean done. And in that moment, as the city slept below her, she understood something deeper. The world might have forgotten her once, but she would never be forgotten again. She had outlasted them all.